Silas Crow didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door to the Cedar Ridge lending office on a Tuesday morning like he owned the building, which, by that point, he essentially did, and dropped a single folded document onto the desk in front of Harold Finch, the territory's junior land clerk, without saying a word. Harold looked at the paper, then looked up at Crow's face, and whatever question had formed in his mouth died there. "Stamp it," Crow said. "Mr. Crow, this property still has an active—" "I said stamp it, Harold." The stamp came down. The Mercer family's water rights, 3 generations of survival built around a single cold water spring that never ran dry, not even in the worst drought years anyone could remember, transferred to Silas Crow's holding company before the ink was dry on the page. Outside, half a mile up the valley road, Abigail Mercer was loading milk bottles onto her wagon in the dark, counting what she had, counting what she owed, already calculating whether today's route would be enough to keep the wolves another week from her door. She had no idea she had just lost the one thing her father had always said they could never lose. If this story already has your heart beating a little faster, you're exactly where you should be. Hit the like button right now. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe and follow along, because the stories we tell in this valley don't end quietly, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The cold that settled over the Bitterroot Valley in the last weeks of October 1889 was the kind that didn't announce itself. It came in slowly, the way serious trouble always does. First a thin skim of ice along the water troughs at dawn, then a stiffening in the mud that made the wagon wheels groan, then mornings so dark and so still that the only sound Abigail Mercer heard when she stepped outside was her own breath dissolving into nothing. She was 24 years old. She had been running the dairy alone for 11 months, since the morning her mother found her father face down in the field between the barn and the house, his heart simply done with the work of keeping him upright. 11 months of 4 in the morning wake-ups, of cracked hands and sore shoulders and mental arithmetic that never quite balanced in her favor, of smiling at customers along her route, because smiling was free and it kept people loyal. She had 14 stops on her morning route. She knew every doorstep, every dog, every customer's preference. Old Mrs. Halverson at the edge of town wanted her bottles left on the left side of the step, always, because the right side got shadow, and shadow meant the milk cooled uneven, though Abigail privately believed it made no difference at all. The Kowalski brothers at the feed store wanted 2 quarts and would argue about the price every single week and pay it without complaint every single time. The new school teacher, Miss Danner, had started buying a pint every other day, and Abigail had quietly begun leaving a little extra in the bottle because the woman looked like she hadn't had a solid meal since August. These people were not just customers. They were, in the plainest possible sense, the reason Abigail still owned a ranch. She also owed Fielding's lending house $63 and some cents. It wasn't an impossible number, not in a good season. But the previous summer had been dry. One of her 2 best dairy cows had gone lame in August and recovered slowly, and somewhere in the shuffle of grief and exhaustion and the 1,000 small decisions that came with running a property alone, she had missed 2 payments. 2. The kind of thing that should have been a conversation, a brief embarrassment, a shake of the hand, and a renegotiated schedule. What it had become instead was something else entirely. But that morning, loading bottles in the dark, she didn't know that yet. She finished loading, climbed onto the wagon bench, and clucked her horse forward. The animal, a broad-shouldered bay gelding named Sherman, who had the disposition of a man who has made peace with his circumstances, leaned into the traces without complaint, and the wagon rolled out of the yard and onto the valley road as the first gray smear of light appeared behind the eastern peaks. The route took her east first, toward the older properties that had been settled longest, and whose owners were the most reliable in their habits. She made 6 stops before the sun was fully up, exchanging bottles and pleasantries and occasional news, collecting coins and folding them into the leather pouch she kept tucked under the wagon bench. The 7th stop was new. The Granger place had been dark for years. The original Granger family, Ben and Marta and their 2 boys, Owen and Elias, had fallen apart the way families sometimes did in the territory. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until the house sat empty and the fields went to seed, and people in Cedar Ridge stopped talking about what had happened there because talking about it made everyone uncomfortable. Abigail remembered the Granger boys vaguely from childhood. Owen had been older by several years and had worked his father's land from the time he could walk. Elias had been quieter, the kind of boy who watched more than he spoke. What she knew for certain was that someone had moved back into the Granger house 3 weeks ago, because smoke had started rising from the chimney again, and old Harold Finch had mentioned at the general store that the younger Granger boy had come back to reclaim the property. She almost hadn't added the stop. New customers meant new trust to build, and she had enough on her mind without the effort of introducing herself to a stranger. But the Granger property sat right in the middle of her route, and the practical part of her brain, which was most of her brain, most of the time, pointed out that passing a potential customer twice a day without stopping was the kind of waste she couldn't afford. She pulled Sherman up at the gate and looked at the house. Light in the window, smoke rising clean and steady, someone up early. She climbed down, pulled 2 sample bottles from the crate, and walked to the door. She knocked. There was a long enough pause that she thought maybe no one had heard, and she raised her hand to knock again just as the door opened. The man who opened it was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. I was tall, a little over 6 feet, with the kind of frame that suggested he had done serious physical work for most of his adult life. Broad through the shoulders, lean everywhere else. His dark hair was uncombed and his jaw carried 2 or 3 days of stubble. I was wearing a flannel shirt that hadn't been tucked in yet and holding a coffee cup like it was the most important thing in the room. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Fresh milk," she said. 10 cents a bottle. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. He leaned against the door frame and looked at the bottles in her hand, then back at her face. "I'll take 2, he said, "if you'll come in and have breakfast." It was such an unexpected thing to say that for a moment Abigail simply stood there, trying to determine whether he was serious or joking, or perhaps not entirely awake yet. "I'm making eggs," he added, as if that settled it. "Already got the pan on." "I have 11 more stops," she said. "They'll wait 10 minutes." She almost said no. The practical part of her brain was already forming the sentence. She had a schedule, she had deliveries to make. She didn't have time to sit down in a stranger's kitchen because he had a pan on the stove and a disarming way of standing in doorways. What she said was, "I can't stay long." His name was Elias Granger, and he had been back in the valley for 22 days. He had spent those 22 days doing what could be done by one person working alone, repairing fences, clearing debris from the drainage ditches, inventorying what the years of neglect had cost him, and calculating what it would take to make the land productive again. The calculation was not encouraging, but he had known before he came back that it wouldn't be. He'd come back anyway. He made her eggs over easy, which was how she liked them, though she hadn't said so. He put bread on the table and poured her coffee without asking how she took it, and then sat down across from her and didn't make conversation for almost a full minute, which she found, to her surprise, more comfortable than most people's attempts at conversation. You grew up here," he said eventually. It wasn't a question. "Born here," she said. "My father had the dairy on the west side of the valley. I run it now." "Mercer?" "That's right." He nodded slowly. "I remember your father. Good man." "He was." A pause. Neither of them pressed it. "How long have you been running it alone?" he asked. 11 months. He looked at her steadily. "That's a long time." "It's enough time to know what you're doing," she said, which was not exactly a response to what he'd said, but he accepted it as one. She left 12 minutes after she'd arrived, climbed back onto the wagon, and continued her route. She didn't think about the breakfast again until that evening, when she was washing bottles in the cold and calculating the day's earnings against the week's expenses, and the number came up short again, and she found herself very briefly thinking about the eggs over easy and the coffee and the minute of comfortable silence. She pushed the thought aside. She had too much to think about already. 3 days later, she stopped again. He was already at the door before she knocked, which meant he had heard the wagon coming up the road. Which meant, though neither of them acknowledged this, that he had been expecting her. 2 bottles, he said, 10 cents each. "I know the price." He handed over the coins and then held the door open and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite classify. "Eggs are on." "You cook eggs every morning?" "Seems like the right thing to have in the morning." She went in. This time, the silence lasted longer before either of them spoke, and it was she who broke it. What happened to your family's place? She asked, because she had been wondering since the first visit, and because she had found there was very little value in not asking things you wanted to know. The change in his expression was subtle but real. He set his coffee cup down. My brother Owen was accused of cattle theft, he said. About 6 years ago. He didn't do it, but by the time that became clear to anyone who mattered, he'd already lost his stake here and left the territory. My parents followed him. I was in Wyoming by then, working for a cattle outfit. I came back when I heard the property was about to go to tax foreclosure. And Owen? I don't know where he is. He said it plainly, without drama, which somehow made it worse. I've been trying to find out. Abigail was quiet for a moment. Do you know who made the accusation? He looked at her. I have a pretty good idea. Crow, she said. The words sat between them. Elias studied her face. You know him. He holds paper on half the property in this valley, she said. Or he did. It's probably more than half now. Do you have debt through him? Through Fielding's lending house, she said, which I'm told Crow bought out sometime in the spring. She paused. I found that out 2 weeks ago when I went in to discuss renegotiating my payment schedule, and the man behind the desk told me the loan had been transferred and I would need to speak to the new holder directly. Have you? I've tried. She looked at her coffee. His office in town told me Mr. Crow wasn't available. I've tried 3 times. Elias was quiet for a moment. What's he after? My spring, she said. My father dug it 20 years ago. It runs clean year-round, even in drought years. It feeds my dairy operation, but it could feed a dozen operations if someone controlled the water rights. She looked up. Crow's been buying up every water source in the valley for the past 3 years. Mine is the last significant one he doesn't control. Elias said nothing for a long moment. My brother's land had a creek running through it, he said quietly. Fed by snowmelt off the North Ridge. Best water source in the eastern half of the valley. Abigail looked at him. Owen lost his property, Elias said. 6 months after Crow made his first offer on the water rights. Owen refused the offer. The kitchen was very quiet. It's the same man, Abigail said. Yes, Elias said. It's the same man. She didn't tell her mother about the conversations at the Granger house. Her mother, Ruth, was 61 and had survived a life that would have undone most people, but the past year had worn her down in ways that weren't entirely visible from the outside. She still got up every morning. She still helped with the bottling in the evenings. She still made sure Abigail ate something that wasn't just bread and coffee. But there was a fragility now that hadn't been there before her husband died, a carefulness in the way she moved through the house, as if she was afraid of taking up too much space. Abigail protected her mother from the worst of the financial worry the way you'd protect a fire from wind, not by pretending the wind didn't exist, but by placing yourself between it and the flame. When the letter arrived, she opened it alone. It was from Crow's office. Formal language, very precise, the kind of phrasing that had been written by someone who had written many such letters and had learned exactly how much to say and exactly how much to leave unstated. The substance of it was this: her outstanding debt, now held by Crow Land and Development, was being called in full. Not renegotiated, not restructured, called. She had 45 days, $63. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she read it. The number had not changed. What had changed was the door that had been between her and the number. That door was now closed. She put the letter in the tin box under her bed where she kept important documents, and she went out to check on the cows. And she did not cry until she was in the barn, which was, she had learned, the best place for it. The animals didn't care. The sound was absorbed by the hay, and she could be done with it in 5 minutes, and back to work before anyone knew she'd needed to stop. She told Elias the next morning. Not because she'd decided to trust him, exactly. More because she had been carrying the information alone for 3 days, and the weight of it was affecting her ability to think clearly, and clear thinking was the one thing she couldn't afford to lose. She told him about the letter. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she had miscalculated, if the comfort she had begun to feel in these brief morning visits had given her a false sense of what this was. Maybe he was just a man who liked eggs and company and had no interest in someone else's trouble. Then he said, 45 days is enough time. Enough time for what? To find what we need. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the yard. Crow has been doing this for years, which means there's a trail, property records, lending documents, the original complaint filed against Owen. All of that has to exist somewhere. Men like Crow are careful, but they're not invisible. They leave paper because the paper is how they make things legal. And if we find it, he turned from the window, then we take it to someone who can do something with it. The territorial marshal is 3 days' ride. I know. She looked at him. Why would you do this? Your problem is your brother. Mine is my ranch. They're connected, but they're not the same problem. He looked back at her for a moment with an expression she still couldn't entirely read. Because if I find what happened to Owen, he said carefully, it probably clears the path for your ranch at the same time. And because... He stopped. Because what? Because I've watched one family get destroyed by this man already, he said. I'm not going to watch another one if there's something I can do about it. It was a practical answer, a sensible answer. It left out whatever else might have been living underneath it, and that was fine. Abigail was a practical person. She understood the value of leaving certain things unstated until they were ready to be said. All right, she said. What do we start with? What they started with was the Cedar Ridge County Records Office, which was housed in a low brick building on the east side of town between the assay office and a hardware store that smelled permanently of turpentine. Elias went on a Wednesday, because Wednesday was when the clerk who had the best memory worked the afternoon shift, a thin, nervous man named Alton Vess, who had been recording land transactions in Cedar Ridge for 19 years, and who, Elias suspected, remembered every one of them. Abigail had offered to come. Elias had told her to make her route. Two people arriving together to dig through old land records would draw attention. One person looking up his own family's property history was unremarkable. Alton Vess was behind the counter when Elias walked in, entering figures into a ledger with the concentrated misery of a man who had been doing the same task for several hours. "Help you?" he said, without looking up. "Looking for some property records," Elias said. "Granger family. My family. I'm trying to establish clear title on the property I've reclaimed." Vess looked up then, and something in his expression shifted very slightly. Not alarm, not guilt, just a kind of careful neutrality that Elias noted without showing he had noticed. "That would be the parcel on the eastern ridge?" "That's right. I can pull those." Vess moved to the filing cabinet and began sorting through folders with practiced efficiency. "Should be straightforward. Property reverted to county through tax delinquency. No encumbrances at the time of reversion." He pulled a folder and set it on the counter. "Here you are." Elias opened it and began reading. He was not looking for anything related to the Granger title directly. "I was looking for anything adjacent to it, anything involving the properties that had bordered the Granger land, anything that might carry Crow's name or the name of any Crow-connected entity." He found it on the 4th page. A transfer record, dated 4 months before Owen's arrest. The water rights to the creek running through the Granger property had been recorded as belonging to, not Crow directly, but to a company called Bitterroot Water and Grazing, Ltd. Elias had never heard of that company. He was fairly certain that company had not existed before someone needed it to. He copied the name carefully onto a piece of paper he'd brought for the purpose. "Is there a record of Bitterroot Water and Grazing filing any documentation in this county?" he asked Vess, keeping his voice even. Vess stilled very slightly, just for a moment. Then he was moving again, back to the filing cabinet. "I'd have to look." "I'd appreciate it." What Vess brought back was thin, just 2 pages, but it was enough. Bitterroot Water and Grazing, Ltd. had been registered in Cedar Ridge County in the spring of 1883, 6 years prior. Its listed officer was a man named Clarence Dodd, who Elias did not recognize. But the registered address for correspondence was a building on Merchant Street that Elias knew very well. It was Silas Crow's office building. He told Abigail that evening. She had finished her route and was cleaning bottles in the yard, her sleeves rolled up despite the cold, her hands red from the water. She went still when he told her about the water rights transfer. 4 months before the accusation, she said. "Yes." So the water rights were already moved before Owen was arrested, which means the arrest wasn't about cattle, Elias said. It was about getting Owen off the land after the water rights were already gone. He probably didn't even know the rights had been transferred. He would have found out eventually, but by then he was already accused of theft and fighting for his freedom, Abigail finished. And then he left, and the land went to delinquency. and Crow picked up the grazing rights through Bitterroot. Abigail set down the bottle she was holding. He does it in pieces, she said. That's how he keeps it looking legal. He separates the parts. Water rights to one company, grazing rights to another, the land itself through tax foreclosure. By the time anyone looks at the whole picture, all the pieces are already gone. Yes, Elias said, and he's doing the same thing to my family. He already has the lending paper. He'll call it in, and if you can't pay, he'll take the land. The water rights he'll claim separately, probably has documentation already prepared to argue they're attached to the lending agreement somehow. She could see him working through it. What he needs is the land itself to clear foreclosure. Then he has everything. Except he doesn't have 45 days worth of patience, Abigail said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. He's been waiting on my family's property for years. He'll push if he thinks I'm vulnerable. How visible are you on your route? Elias asked. How well do your customers know your situation? Well enough that if something changed for the worse, people would notice. Good. He thought for a moment. Keep the route exactly as it is. Don't change anything. He's watching to see if you're panicking, because panic means you're about to make a mistake he can use. She looked at him. You've thought about this kind of thing before. I've thought about Crow for a long time, he said. How long? He looked out at the darkening valley. Since the day Owen rode out of here, 6 years. He paused. I should have come back sooner. I kept thinking I needed to have something solid before I came back, some piece of proof, some leverage. Then I ran out of reasons to wait. She heard something in his voice that she recognized, the specific guilt of someone who believes they failed to act when action was possible. You didn't know, she said. Not the whole shape of it. I knew enough. She didn't argue with him. Some things you had to let a person carry. What do we need next? She asked instead. The original complaint against Owen, the document that started the theft accusation. It'll be in the sheriff's records, and the name of whoever signed it. She nodded slowly. I know someone who might help with that. Who? The woman who was married to the deputy who processed Owen's case, she said. Her name is Vera Hutchins. She's a widow now, lives on the edge of town. She's been buying milk from me for 3 years. We talk. She paused. She's mentioned Owen's case before. She never seemed comfortable with how it was handled. Elias was quiet for a moment. Could she be trusted? He asked. I think she's been waiting for someone to ask the right questions, Abigail said. I think she's been carrying something for 6 years. It was the most she had said in any single conversation since her father died. She realized it and felt, not embarrassed exactly, but aware that something between them had shifted without her deciding it should, the way certain things in a life shift before you've had a chance to decide anything about them at all. She picked up the bottle again. I'll talk to her tomorrow, she said. After my route. Elias nodded. He helped her with the remaining bottles without being asked, and they worked in silence as the last of the light left the sky, and neither of them said anything more about what they were building toward. But both of them knew it was coming, and both of them knew that when it arrived, they would need to be ready. The valley was cold and quiet and watching, the way valleys do. And somewhere on the far side of it, in a building on Merchant Street, a man named Silas Crow sat behind a large desk and counted what he owned, and did not yet know that 2 people he had dismissed entirely had begun, very carefully and very quietly, to count back. Vera Hutchins lived in a narrow house at the edge of Cedar Ridge that had once been painted white and was now the color of old cream, the paint lifting at the corners in long, curling strips that no one had gotten around to fixing since her husband Walter died. She kept the yard neat, which was more than could be said for the paint, and she had a habit of sitting on her porch in the late morning with a cup of tea, even when the temperature didn't invite it, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl that had belonged to Walter, and that she wore with the unself-conscious practicality of a woman who had stopped caring what things looked like and started caring only whether they worked. Abigail had always liked her. Vera was the kind of person who said what she meant and meant what she said, and didn't dress either one up in politeness when politeness wasn't warranted. She was on the porch when Abigail arrived, which saved the trouble of knocking. You're late today, Vera said, watching her come up the path. Route take longer? I had a stop to make first. Abigail set the milk bottle on the porch rail and sat down in the other chair without waiting to be invited, because Vera had told her 6 months ago to stop waiting to be invited. I need to ask you something, and I want to ask it plainly, because I don't have time to come at it sideways. Vera looked at her over her tea. All right. Owen Granger, Abigail said. The cattle theft accusation 6 years ago. Walter processed the complaint. I need to know who filed it. There was a silence. A chickadee landed on the porch rail 6 inches from the milk bottle, regarded it with brief suspicion, and flew off. Vera watched it go. Why are you asking about that now? She said. Because Owen's brother came back. And because the same man who took Owen's land is now coming for mine. Vera set her teacup down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady. Silas Crow, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Another silence, longer this time. Vera looked out at the yard for a long moment, at the bare garden beds and the fence posts that needed resetting, and the life that had accumulated around her in 30 years of living in this town. Walter didn't sleep well the last 2 years of his life, she said finally. I thought it was his back. He had trouble with his back. She paused. After he died, I found a journal. He kept a journal, which I never knew. Walter wasn't a writing kind of man, that's what I would have told you. But he had one, and I read it. She stopped again. Was Owen Granger in it? Abigail asked. The complaint was filed by a man named Denny Pruitt, Vera said. He worked cattle for one of the ranches north of the Granger property. Walter wrote that Pruitt came in looking scared, which Walter thought was strange because the complaint was supposedly his own grievance. A man filing a complaint against his neighbor for stealing cattle is angry, not scared. She picked up her tea, looked at it, set it back down. Walter asked Pruitt directly who had told him to file the complaint. Pruitt wouldn't answer. Walter wrote that Pruitt looked at a point somewhere past Walter's left shoulder the entire time, the way a man looks when he's been told what to say and is afraid of forgetting it. Was Crow's name anywhere in Walter's journal? Not directly, Vera said. Walter was careful. He wrote around it. But he wrote that 2 days after the complaint was filed, he was called into a meeting with the county sheriff and a man he described only as the merchant. And after that meeting, the investigation into Pruitt's original complaint was closed and Owen Granger's arrest warrant was processed instead. Abigail sat with that for a moment. Would you let me see the journal? She asked. Vera was quiet for long enough that Abigail thought the answer was going to be no. Then the older woman stood up and went inside without a word, and came back 4 minutes later carrying a small leather-bound book that was worn soft at the corners and had a strip of cloth marking a page somewhere in the middle. She held it out. I've been sitting on this for 2 years, Vera said, trying to decide what to do with it. I'm 63 years old, and I'm tired of carrying it. Abigail took the journal. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just make sure it means something. Vera sat back down and picked up her tea again. You want to know something else? Yes. Denny Pruitt left Cedar Ridge 8 months after Owen did. Moved his family out in the middle of the night. Never came back. She looked at Abigail steadily. People don't leave in the middle of the night because things went well for them. She brought the journal to Elias that afternoon, after she had read it herself twice on the wagon ride back. He was on the south fence line when she arrived, resetting a post that had heaved in the freeze, and he came to the gate when he saw her wagon. She handed him the journal and watched his face as he read. He read slowly. She had noticed that about him. He didn't skim things. He went through them the way you went through terrain you weren't certain of, one careful step at a time. When he finished the marked section, he closed the book. Denny Pruitt, he said. You know him? I know the name. He worked for a rancher named Calhoun north of our property. I saw him a few times when I was young. Big man. Not unkind, I always thought. He handed the journal back. He must have needed something badly enough to do what Crow asked. Or been afraid of something badly enough. Same difference sometimes. He looked out at the road. We need to find out where Pruitt went. Vera said he left in the middle of the night. That kind of departure doesn't leave a forwarding address. No, Elias agreed. But there are only so many places you can go in the territory if you're moving a family with no money and no notice. He'd need work. He'd need somewhere that didn't ask too many questions about why he left. He thought for a moment. Helena, Butte, maybe Missoula if he went far enough. That's a lot of ground. I know a man in Helena who trades information the way other men trade cattle, Elias said. I can write to him. It'll take 2 weeks to get a response, maybe 3. Abigail calculated. 45 days from the letter, minus 6 days already gone. We have time, but not much. Then we don't waste any. He looked at her directly. There's something else I want to look at. The original land survey for your father's property, specifically the spring and water rights documentation. If Crow is planning to claim those rights through the lending agreement, there has to be language somewhere in your loan documents that he's using as a justification. I want to see what he's working with. I have the original loan papers, she said. My father kept everything. Can you bring them? Tomorrow morning, she said, with the milk. Something almost like a smile crossed his face. I'll have eggs on. Try it. She found the papers that night, in the same tin box where she'd put Crow's demand letter. Her father had been meticulous about paperwork, a quality she'd inherited and that she was now grateful for in a way she hadn't expected to feel. The loan documents from Fielding's lending house were dated 4 years back, written in the dense, contracted language of a legal agreement, the kind of language designed to be technically clear and practically impenetrable at the same time. She read them at the kitchen table, slowly, the way Elias read things. Her mother came through around 8 o'clock, stopping when she saw the papers spread out under the lamp. "What's all that?" Ruth asked. "The Fielding loan papers." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down at the other end of the table without asking permission, which she almost never did anymore. She moved around the house as a guest in her own life, apologizing for space she had every right to take. "Are we in trouble?" Ruth asked. Abigail looked up. Her mother's face in the lamplight was tired and careful and older than it should have been. She was not a woman to be protected from everything. She was a woman who had buried a husband and kept standing. The least Abigail could do was tell her the truth. "We have 45 days to pay Crow $63, Abigail said. "And if we can't pay it, he'll take the land. He wants the spring." Ruth absorbed this without expression. "Can we pay it?" "Not from the root. Not in 45 days, she paused. "I'm working on something else." "With the Granger boy?" Abigail looked at her. "His name is Elias." "I know his name." Ruth folded her hands on the table. "I knew his parents. I knew Owen. That was a terrible thing, what happened to that family." She was quiet for a moment. "Is he trustworthy?" It was the question Abigail had been asking herself since the first morning she'd walked into his kitchen, and the honest answer had been changing, incrementally, since then. "I think so," she said. "He's careful. He doesn't say more than he knows. He's patient." Ruth looked at her for a moment with the particular expression mothers develop for reading the spaces between what their children say. "All right," she said, and got up and went to bed. Abigail turned back to the loan documents. She found what she was looking for on page 7. Buried in a clause about collateral, the kind of clause that is written to look standard and routine when it is in fact neither, was language specifying that in the event of default, all appurtenant rights attached to the property, including but not limited to mineral, water, and grazing rights, would be transferred to the lender as part of the security agreement. She read it 3 times. It had been there since her father signed. He wouldn't have understood it. He was a farmer, not a lawyer, and the man at Fielding's desk would not have explained it in plain language. Why would he? The clause was written to be invisible until it was needed, and now it was needed. She sat with that understanding for a long time. Then she put the papers back in order, put them in the tin box, and went to bed, because there was nothing else to do that night, and she had to be up before 4. She told Elias about the clause the next morning. He read the relevant section twice, his expression not changing, and then set the papers down and drank some of his coffee. "Standard language?" she asked. "Not standard," he said. "Carefully written to look standard. There's a difference." He tapped the page. This was in there before Crow acquired the loan, which means either Fielding's had this language in all their agreements, which would have been unusual, or someone added it in anticipation of a transfer. "You mean Crow had this planned even before he bought the loan?" "I mean, it's possible." He paused. "We need to find out what Fielding's standard loan language looked like. If this clause appears in documents from before Crow had any connection to Fielding's, then it's just aggressive but legal boilerplate. If it only appears in the Mercer loan, then it was inserted specifically," Abigail finished, "which is fraud." "Arguably," he said carefully. "We'd need someone who knows territorial property law to make that argument, and we'd need to find other Fielding's borrowers who can show their agreements didn't have this language." "I know 3 families who borrowed through Fielding's," Abigail said. The Petersons, the Halverson sons, and Jim Carver on the South Road. Would they talk to you? Carver would. He's been suspicious of Crow since that business with the grazing lease 2 years ago. Crow tried to claim Carver's west pasture through some amended survey, and Carver fought him off, but just barely. She paused. The Halversons are more cautious. They have 6 children. Men with 6 children don't take risks. Then start with Carver, Elias said. She went to see Jim Carver on Thursday afternoon, after a morning that had already run long because one of her cows had been off her feed and required 40 minutes of attention before Abigail was satisfied enough to leave. She arrived at Carver's place, with her shoulders tight and her patient slightly thinner than she would have liked, which was perhaps not ideal given that she was about to ask a favor from a man she knew only well enough to wave at on the road. Carver was a square-built man in his mid-50s with a gray beard and the hands of someone who had worked outdoors for 30 years. He met her at the fence line and looked at her with the mild wariness of a man who has learned that unexpected visitors rarely bring simple news. "Miss Mercer," he said, "what brings you out this way? Your route doesn't come past here." "No," she agreed. "I'm here about something else. Do you have a few minutes?" He studied her for a moment, then unlatched the fence gate. "Come in, then." She explained it as plainly as she could, leaving out the parts that were still uncertain and focusing on what she knew. The clause in her loan documents, the water rights, Crow's demand letter. She told him she was trying to determine whether the clause had been in Fielding's standard agreements before Crow acquired the lending house. Carver listened without interrupting. When she finished, he scratched the side of his jaw and looked at the ground. "I have my loan papers," he said. "Somewhere. Martha keeps things organized. I'd have to ask her." "I'd appreciate it if you would. I'm not asking you to do anything with them yet. I just want to see if the language matches." "Yet," he said, with the flatness of a man noting a word that carries more weight than the sentence around it. "Yet," she confirmed. He looked at her for a long moment. "Crow's come after my place before," he said finally. "You know that. I know he tried to claim your west pasture. He did more than try. He had a man show up with papers claiming my fence line was 30 feet inside a corrected survey boundary. Claimed I'd been running cattle on land that wasn't mine for 8 years. He shook his head. "I had my original survey. I had the corners staked. I made him prove every inch of his claim in front of the county assessor, and in the end, he couldn't." He paused. "But it cost me 4 months and $200 in surveyor fees, and that was the point, wasn't it? Not to win, just to make it expensive." "That's exactly the point," Abigail said. "He drains you until you can't fight anymore." "Martha!" Carver called toward the house without any further deliberation. When his wife appeared at the door, he said, "The Mercer girl needs to look at our Fielding's papers. Can you find them?" Martha Carver, a compact woman with sharp eyes and the efficient movements of someone who ran a 6-person household and did it without complaint, disappeared and returned in 3 minutes with a folder. She handed it to Abigail and stayed on the porch while Abigail and Jim looked through it. The Carver loan had been signed 2 years before the Mercer loan. The collateral clause was 3 paragraphs from the bottom of page 6. Abigail read it twice and then read it again. It did not contain the water and mineral rights language. "Well," Carver said, reading over her shoulder. "Well," she agreed. "So they put that in yours specifically?" "It appears so." He looked at her steadily. "What are you going to do with that?" "I'm still working that out," she said honestly. "But knowing it's there, knowing it's specific, changes what we can argue and where we can argue it. Who's we?" She hesitated for just a moment. "Elias Granger. He came back to reclaim his family's property." Carver's expression did something complicated. "Granger," he said quietly. "Owen's brother." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Owen Granger was a decent man," he said. "What happened to him was not right. Most people in this valley know it, even if they never said so." He looked out at his fields. "If there's something that can be done about it, I'd like to know." "We may need your loan documents as evidence," Abigail said, "if we get to the point where evidence matters." "Where would you be taking it?" "The territorial marshal. If we can build a complete enough case." Carver nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "You can use them. But you tell me what's happening before you do anything. I don't want to find myself standing in front of a marshal without knowing what I agreed to." "That's fair," she said. She thanked him and drove back toward Cedar Ridge in the fading afternoon light, the folder beside her on the bench, and she let herself feel, briefly, something that wasn't quite hope but lived in the same neighborhood. The specific satisfaction of a thing that looked impossible beginning to look merely very difficult. The letter from Elias's contact in Helena arrived on a Friday, which was 12 days after Elias had sent it. He was at her ranch when it arrived, having come over to help rework the latch on the dairy barn door that had been giving her trouble for 2 weeks. He was still working on it when she came out with the envelope. He opened it at the workbench, reading with the same slow deliberateness he brought to everything written, while she held the lantern and pretended not to watch his face. "Pruitt is in Butte," he said. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. His contact found him working at one of the mining company offices. Bookkeeping. He read further. He's been there 5 years, wife and 2 boys, settled, quiet, no apparent connection to Cedar Ridge anymore. He looked up. He doesn't know anyone's been looking. Can we get to him? Butte is 4 days there and back, Elias said. I'd have to go alone. You can't leave the route. I know. She hated knowing it, but she knew it. The route was 40 cents a day when everything was running, and 40 cents a day was the margin between staying and going under. Can you convince him to talk? I don't know, Elias said honestly. He's built a life. He has something to lose. Men who have something to lose make different calculations than men who have nothing. He set the letter down. But he also watched an innocent man lose everything because of a lie Pruitt helped tell. That's been living inside him for 6 years. That kind of thing finds the cracks eventually. You're going, she said. It wasn't a question. I'll leave Monday. She nodded. She thought about saying something else. Something about being careful, or about the fact that his going meant 3 things they had been building together would have to wait. What she said instead was, I'll keep the route. I'll talk to the Halversons. I'll see if there are other borrowers. Keep the journal somewhere safe, he said, and the Carver documents. I know. He went back to the latch, and she went back inside, and the evening settled over the valley the way evenings did at that time of year, fast and final, the dark coming in from the east like something that had been waiting just over the ridge all day. He left on Monday morning before her route started. She didn't see him go. She found out he was gone when she stopped at the Granger gate on her way through and saw that the house was dark, and Sherman, who had a good memory for routines, lifted his head and looked at the house, and then looked at her and went back to walking. She kept moving. The Halversons were harder than Carver, as she'd expected. There were 2 of them, brothers, Thomas and Clem, who ran adjacent properties and made most major decisions in consultation with each other, which meant that getting either one to do anything required getting both of them to agree, and getting both of them to agree required navigating around their mutual habit of positioning themselves on opposite sides of every question until they'd thoroughly discussed it. She went on Tuesday afternoon and found them both in the yard of Thomas's place, arguing about a fence alignment that had apparently been under negotiation since August. They stopped arguing when she arrived and looked at her with the identical cautious expression of 2 men who are relieved to be interrupted but uncertain whether the interruption will be better or worse than what it's interrupting. She explained her situation. She asked to see their Fielding's documents. She watched them exchange the look that brothers develop over years of shared decisions. The look that contains a whole conversation compressed into a glance. It's a big ask, Thomas said. I know, she said. Getting involved in something with Crow, Clem said, has a history of going badly. I know that too. You're 4 payments short, Thomas said. That's what people are saying. 2 payments short, she said. The rest is Crow's arithmetic. Another exchanged look. Our papers are in the house, Thomas said finally. I'll get them. The Halverson loan had been signed 3 years back, between the Carver loan and the Mercer loan. Their collateral clause was identical to Carver's, standard language, no mention of water or mineral rights, which meant the specific language in Abigail's agreement had been introduced within the last 4 years, when it was useful, when there was something worth taking. Well, Clem said. Well, Thomas said. They looked at each other. Then they looked at her. What do you need from us? Thomas asked. By the end of the 2nd week, she had spoken to 5 families. 3 of them had Fielding's loan agreements that predated the Mercer loan. None of them contained the water rights clause. The other 2 had signed after, and both of their agreements did contain it, in identical language to hers, though neither of those families had springs or water sources of significant value. It was as though the clause had been inserted into all new agreements once the template had been changed, which would have made it look standard to anyone signing. She organized everything at the kitchen table 3 nights in a row, building what she thought of as the shape of it, the outline of something you could show a person and have them see, in 15 minutes, what had taken her weeks to put together. When Elias came back from Butte on the 14th day, she was ready to show it to him. He arrived at dusk, road-worn and quieter than usual, his horse needing water and feed before anything else. She waited while he saw to the animal, and when he came to the fence and looked at her, she could tell from his face that something had happened in Butte, and she couldn't yet tell if it was something good or something worse. He talked, Elias said. She waited. It took 2 days, he said. He didn't want to. He kept saying he'd left all of it behind, that it was done, that there was no point in going back to it. He rubbed the back of his neck. On the second evening, I told him what Crow was doing to the Mercer family. I told him about the spring and the water rights and the 45 days. I didn't tell him to make him feel guilty. I told him because he deserved to know that the thing he'd helped set in motion 6 years ago hadn't stopped. What did he say? He didn't say anything for a long time, Elias said. Then he said, Crow told me if I didn't file the complaint, my family would lose our place. He had a lien on our property that I hadn't even known existed. He'd bought our debt 6 months earlier without telling us. He showed me the paperwork and told me it would be called in the following week if I didn't cooperate. He paused. Pruitt wasn't a willing accomplice. He was a man with children and a mortgage, and someone had a gun to his head in everything but the literal sense. Will he give a statement? He's writing it now. His wife talked to him that evening. I don't know what she said, but when I saw him the next morning, he'd made his decision. He said he wanted it done while he still had the nerve. Elias reached into his coat and produced a folded envelope. He sent this with me, witnessed and signed. It names Crow directly. It describes the conversation, the lien threat, the instructions on what to say and when. It includes the date and the amount of money Crow's man gave him afterward. She took the envelope carefully. It felt impossibly light for what it contained. Crow paid him, she said. Not much. Enough to look like a transaction rather than a coincidence. She looked at the envelope for a moment, then at Elias. He was watching her with an expression that she was getting better at reading. It was the expression of someone who has done a hard thing and is not sure yet whether the cost was worth it. Are you all right? She asked. He seemed slightly surprised by the question. I'm tired, he said, and I keep thinking about Owen in some town somewhere, not knowing any of this is happening. He looked down at his hands. I sent him a letter through the contact in Helena. I don't know if it'll find him. I don't even know for certain that He stopped. He's alive, she said. Not as reassurance, just as a fact she chose to believe, and offered. Elias looked at her. He's alive, she said again, and when this is done, he'll have something to come back to. The valley was dark now. The cold settled in around them. The horses quiet. The spring running somewhere beyond the fence line with its steady, patient sound. She held Walter Hutchins' journal and Denny Pruitt's signed statement and 3 families' loan documents, and across from her a man who had come home with nothing but his name and a 6-year-old debt to his brother stood at the fence line and nodded once, slowly, like a man who has decided to believe something because the alternative is to stop moving. We have enough, she said. I think we have enough. Not yet, he said. Not quite. He straightened up. But close. She nodded. Close was different from not enough. Close was something you could work with. She had learned that this year, across 11 months of 4 in the morning wake-ups and short arithmetic and a route she drove whether she felt like it or not. Close, in her experience, was where the real work began. They had 26 days left when Crow made his first move. Abigail knew it had happened before she reached the spring that morning because the ground around the access path had been disturbed. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the specific way that ground gets disturbed when several men have walked over it in the dark and tried not to leave evidence of having done so. She knew how her own land looked in the early morning. She had been looking at it for 24 years. She knew the difference between frost-heaved soil and soil that had been recently compressed and then allowed to settle. There were wooden stakes at the edge of the spring clearing, 4 of them, driven into the ground at intervals, each one with a strip of orange cloth tied at the top. Survey markers. or something made to look like survey markers. The kind of thing you put in the ground when you want to tell someone that a line has been drawn and the territory beyond it is no longer theirs to assume. She stood and looked at them for a long moment. Then she pulled each one out of the ground, walked back to the barn, and put them behind the feed bins where they would not be visible from outside. She stood in the barn for a moment, breathing the smell of hay and animals and the particular dust of a working farm, and she told herself that this was a provocation and that responding to a provocation the way the other party wanted you to respond was how you lost before the fight had properly started. Then she went and loaded the wagon and started her route, because the cows didn't know about the steaks, and the milk didn't care, and her customers were waiting. She told Elias at breakfast. He listened to the whole of it before he said anything. Then he said, "How many steaks?" 4. Evenly spaced? Yes. Along the eastern side of the spring clearing. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. That's not a real survey. That's a message. He's telling you he has the resources to make a claim whenever he wants and that he's not afraid to start the process. I know, she said. I pulled them. His eyes came up from the cup. You pulled them. They were on my land. Something moved across his face that she recognized after a moment as reluctant appreciation. If he has a man watching, then he has a man watching me pull stakes off my own property, she said, which tells him I'm not going to make this easy. Which might make him move faster, Elias said, or it might make him reconsider whether I'm as desperate as he's been assuming. She looked at him steadily. Men like Crow bank on desperation. That's the whole architecture of what he does. He waits until someone is desperate enough to do something reckless, or desperate enough to give up. I'm neither. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said, then we move faster too. What moving faster meant, practically, was organizing what they had into something that could be presented coherently, not to each other, but to the territorial marshal, whose name was Amos Greer and whose office was in Helena, 4 days' ride. Elias had already sent a preliminary letter 3 weeks back, outlining the broad nature of the complaint. The response had been cautious, but not dismissive. Marshal Greer had written that he was aware of Silas Crow's name in connection with several property disputes in Bitterroot County, and that if documented evidence of fraud could be produced, his office would receive it, not would act on it, would receive it. That's how they write when they don't want to commit to anything, Elias had told her when the response arrived, but also don't want to close the door. So the door is open, halfway. Getting it fully open required more than what they had, which was the honest frustration of the whole situation. What they had was good. Pruitt's signed statement was the best single piece they'd collected. A direct witness account naming Crow and describing the coercion in specific, verifiable terms. The discrepancy between the Mercer loan language and the Halverson and Carver agreements was compelling, but would need legal interpretation to be actionable. Walter Hutchins' journal was powerful circumstantially, but was the private record of a dead man, which made it admissible in territory disputes only under narrow conditions. What they needed, Elias had concluded, was either a direct documentary link between Crow and the manipulated loan language, something showing that the change had originated with him, or a second witness to the events surrounding Owen's arrest. Preferably both. The documentary link was what occupied Elias for the 4 days following the stakes incident. He had a theory, and the theory rested on a piece of information he had pulled from the county records during his initial visit, the name Clarence Dodd, listed as the registered officer of Bitterroot Water and Grazing, Lutted. If Dodd was a real person and not merely a name Crow had borrowed, there was a possibility he had remained in the territory and was findable. He spent 2 days working through county directories, court records, and the membership lists of the Territorial Business Registry before he found a Clarence Dodd registered as a notary in a town called Prentice, 40 miles east of Cedar Ridge. It was not a common name. He rode to Prentice on the 3rd day without telling Abigail he was going, which was, he acknowledged to himself on the ride out, not a decision she would find entirely acceptable. Prentice was smaller than Cedar Ridge and had the specific quality of a town that had expected more from itself. The notary's office was on the 2nd floor of a building that housed a dentist on the ground floor, and Clarence Dodd was a small, tidy man in his late 40s who wore a good vest over a soft body and had the alert, watchful eyes of someone who has spent a career dealing in other people's paperwork and knows what secrets look like. He looked at Elias the way you looked at someone you didn't recognize, but who carried themselves like someone who knew something you wished they didn't. "Mr. Dodd," Elias said, "my name is Elias Granger. My family had property in Bitterroot County. I'm trying to establish the ownership history of some water rights connected to that property, and your name appears in the registration documents for a company called Bitterroot Water and Grazing." Dodd's expression didn't change in any visible way, but something behind his eyes went very still, the way small animals go still when they've registered a sound. "I'm a notary," Dodd said. "My name appears in a lot of documents." "As an officer," Elias said. "Not as a notary. There's a distinction." A pause. "That was a long time ago." 6 years, Elias agreed. "What was the nature of your involvement with Bitterroot Water and Grazing?" "I don't remember the specifics. The registered address for the company was Silas Crow's building on Merchant Street in Cedar Ridge," Elias said. "Do you remember that?" The stillness behind Dodd's eyes became something harder to read. He looked at the window, then at his desk, then back at Elias. "I think you should probably tell me what this is actually about," he said, "before this conversation goes any further." Elias told him. He kept it factual and sequenced. Owen's arrest, the water rights transfer 4 months prior, the Pruitt coercion, the manipulated loan language in the Mercer documents, the demand letter with its 45-day deadline. He watched Dodd's face as he talked and saw in it the particular expression of a man who is performing the calculation of what it would cost him to tell the truth against what it would cost him to keep lying. When Elias finished, Dodd was quiet for a while. "I didn't know about the cattle theft accusation," he said finally. "I want to be clear about that. What I did was, I registered the company. I signed the officer documents. Crow's man came to me and said it was for a legitimate water rights holding company, and that my name was needed as a local officer because Crow's business registration was in a different county." He stopped. "I asked if it was legal. He said it was. I charged my standard fee and I signed." "Was it standard for you to serve as a listed officer for companies you had no role in operating?" Dodd looked uncomfortable. "It happens sometimes. Territorial business registration required a local officer if the principal was registered elsewhere. It was a workaround that—" He stopped again. "It was common practice." Elias was back in Cedar Ridge by nightfall. He found Abigail at the fence line of her property, standing very still and looking at something he couldn't see from the road. He tied his horse and walked up to her. She didn't look at him when he arrived. She was looking at the creek that ran along the north edge of her property, and he saw after a moment what she was looking at, or rather, what she wasn't seeing. The creek was lower than it should have been. Not dry, but reduced, running with a thinness that shouldn't have been possible at this time of year, when snowmelt was still feeding the upland sources. "That's new," he said. "Started 3 days ago," she said. "I thought it was natural variation, but 3 days is too long, and it's still dropping." She looked at him then. "There's a diversion dam somewhere upstream. Someone built one." He looked up the creek line, at the stands of pine and alder that closed over it 50 yards north of the property line. "Crow's men." "Has to be." Her voice was very flat. "If the creek drops far enough, the dairy cows don't have enough water. I've been supplementing from the spring, but the spring isn't built for that load. If I run it too hard, I stress the well." She paused. "He's trying to make me fail the operations side, so the default looks natural, like I just couldn't make the ranch work." "It won't hold up legally if he's damming a natural watercourse," Elias said. "Not in the long run, no, but in the short run—" She stopped. 23 days. "Did you find Dodd?" He told her. He watched her face carefully, the way he always watched her face when he brought news, because she received information the way she received everything, directly, without performing a reaction, and then she processed it, and he could see her adjusting the shape of what she knew. "That's 3 witnesses," she said. "Pruitt, Hutchins' journal, and now Dodd. Plus the loan document discrepancy. Plus the water diversion, if we can prove it." "Can you ride tomorrow morning?" he asked. "Early, before your route. I want to go up the creek line and find that dam." "I can ride." They went at 5 in the morning, before the sky was properly light, following the creek north through the pine stands and the alder thickets. The creek bed was rocky and uneven, and the going was slow. They rode without speaking, listening to the water. They found the dam 40 minutes upstream, at a narrow point where 2 outcroppings of rock closed the creek channel to about 8 feet. It wasn't large. A rough structure of stacked stone and driven posts and packed clay, clearly built quickly and without expertise, the kind of thing you built when you wanted the effect and weren't concerned about permanence. But it was enough. A significant portion of the water was being diverted east, away from the Mercer property, into a shallow channel that had been cut in the bank. Someone did this in a night, Elias said, studying the construction. More than one someone, Abigail said. Look at the post placement. These were driven by someone who knew what they were doing. That's not amateur work. He pulled out the small notebook he'd been carrying and began sketching the structure, its dimensions, its location relative to the nearest landmarks, the direction of the diversion channel. She watched him do it and understood without being told what it was for. Evidence, she said. Everything goes in the record, he said, not looking up from the notebook. Every piece of it. She dismounted and walked closer to the dam, examining the construction. The clay at the base was still dark with moisture from the creek, which meant the final sealing had been done recently. 2 days, maybe 3. She pressed her hand against one of the driven posts and found it solid, more solid than a night's work should have produced, which meant either more time or more men than they'd assumed. How many men does he have working for him directly? She asked. On his payroll? I don't know. He has the 2 who came to my property last month, big man and a younger one. He had men at Carver's place during the survey dispute. He has whoever placed those stakes at your spring. He closed the notebook. The operation has scale. He's not doing any of this himself. Which is also how he maintains distance, she said. He can claim he didn't know what his men were doing. Not with Pruitt's statement. Pruitt names Crow by name in a personal conversation. He tucked the notebook away. But we should photograph this if we can, or bring a witness. Jim Carver, she said immediately. He's already agreed to participate, and he's within writing distance. If he sees this directly, his testimony is firsthand. Can he come today? I'll ask him this afternoon. Carver came, and he stood at the dam and looked at it with the expression of a man confirming something he had suspected without wanting to believe. And he said, I want to write down what I'm seeing. And Elias gave him the notebook, and Carver wrote 3 careful paragraphs in the handwriting of a man who had not written much since school, but who was taking the task seriously. They rode back to Abigail's property in the early afternoon. She fed them both, which was the first time she had fed Elias at her, and her mother came through twice on quiet errands that were probably not entirely accidental, and the second time she paused long enough to say, The coffee's still warm, Mr. Granger, which was, from Ruth Mercer, approximately equivalent to a formal endorsement. Elias thanked her and drank the coffee. After Carver had gone, they sat at the table for a while with the document spread between them, the full collection of it, assembled now in a folder Elias had bought in Cedar Ridge for the purpose. Pruitt's statement, Dodd's statement, the journal, the Carver, Halverson, and Peterson loan documents alongside the Mercer loan, the relevant clauses marked. Carver's written account of the diversion dam. The sketch of the dam with its measurements and landmarks. The original record showing Bitterroot Water and Grazing's registered address at Crow's building. She looked at it all laid out and felt the specific weight of accumulated work. The knowledge that each piece had cost something to obtain, and that the whole was worth more than the sum. Is it enough? She asked. To open an investigation, yes, he said. To guarantee a conviction, I don't know. That depends on what the marshal does with it, and what Crow's lawyers do in response. I was quiet for a moment. But there's enough here that Crow can't simply dismiss it. He'll have to answer for it. And a man like Crow, who has never had to answer for anything, is not good at answering. When do we send it? We don't send it, Elias said. We take it, in person, to Helena. He looked at her. I'll go. You have to stay for the route. The route can be covered for 2 days, she said. I'll ask Miss Danner at the school. She's organized, and she knows the stops. He looked at her. You want to come? I want to be there when we hand it over, she said. It's my family's property. He understood that. You didn't send someone else to make the argument that was yours to make. We go together then, he said. They were 2 days from planning their departure when Crow made his second move, and this one was not a message. She came home from her route on a Thursday to find the gate to her property standing open. Not forced, just open, which was worse in a way because it meant someone had unlatched it rather than broken through it. 3 of her cattle were gone. Not injured, not dead, simply gone. The east gate of the pasture was also open, the posts undamaged, the latch working perfectly when she tested it. She stood in the empty pasture for a moment, looking at the 3 animals missing from the count. Then she walked to the barn. 2 of the milk bottles that she had cleaned and set out for the next morning's fill were broken, knocked from the shelf where she stored them, the glass in pieces on the barn floor. The shelf showed no signs of accidental disturbance. It was a deliberate piece of work. She stood in the barn in the early afternoon quiet and felt something that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. The specific feeling of understanding that the other party has decided to stop being subtle. She went to find her mother, who was in the kitchen and had not heard or seen anything because the house faced west and the barn and pasture faced east, and whoever had come had been careful about the approach. Then she went to find Elias. He was at her gate within the hour. He walked the pasture with her, looking at the tracks in the mud near the east gate, several sets of boot prints, and the distinctive shallow gouges of cattle being driven quickly. "They moved them recently," he said, ground still compressed. "So they could still be on the valley road," she said, "or just off it, or already in someone else's pasture with someone else's brand on them." He looked at the tracks for a long moment. "This is the cattle theft angle. He's starting the same play he used on Owen." The words sat between them with the specific gravity of a thing you had been expecting and still weren't fully ready for when it arrived. "He's going to file a complaint," she said. "Probably already has someone ready to file it." He straightened up. "Or he's waiting to see if you go to the sheriff first, in which case the story becomes that you accused the wrong man and that you're desperate in making false accusations. If I don't go to the sheriff, the missing cattle look like I'm hiding something. Yes, either way, he wins the next move." "The move after that is what matters," Elias said, with more steadiness than she felt. "We go to Helena. We go before his complaint can work through the system. We put everything in front of the marshal, and we make the case that this is not 3 missing cattle. This is a pattern going back 6 years, directed by the same man, targeting the same type of property for the same reason." She looked at him. "We were going to leave Saturday." "We leave tomorrow," he said. She went inside and told her mother she would be gone for 4 days, and she arranged with Miss Danner to cover the route, and she wrote a brief note to Jim Carver explaining what had happened and asking him to keep account of who came past his fence line over the next 4 days. And then she went to bed and lay awake for 2 hours listening to the house settle and the spring run its steady course in the dark, and she told herself that they had enough, that they had done the work, that the next 2 days would determine whether all of it amounted to anything. What she didn't tell herself, because she was not a person who found comfort in things she wasn't sure of, was that it would be all right. What she told herself instead was this: "You have done everything you know how to do, and now you go find out if it was enough." That was the most honest thing she had, and she held it. They were 2 hours out of Cedar Ridge by dawn, riding north toward Helena on a road that was frozen at the edges and muddy, in the center where the morning thaw had started, and neither of them spoke much for the first hour, the way you don't speak when you're carrying something and the carrying takes the words. Then Elias said, "I got a letter back." She looked at him. He was looking at the road ahead. "From Owen," he said. The world seemed to go slightly quieter around them, the way it does sometimes when something important has been said. "When?" "Yesterday morning. I didn't want to tell you before we left because I didn't want it to change the plan." He paused. "He's in Billings. He's been there 3 years. He's working as a ranch hand. He didn't know—" His voice changed slightly, just slightly, the way voices do when a person is holding something tightly so it won't get loose in public. "He didn't know anyone was still looking into what happened. He thought it was finished." "Is he coming back?" "He said he wants to. He said he was afraid to because—" He stopped for a moment. "Because he thought the accusation was still standing. Because coming back with an uncleared name would be worse than staying away." She looked at his profile. He was holding himself the way he held himself when something was happening underneath that he wasn't going to let out. Jaw set, eyes forward, hands easy on the reins. "He'll come back," she said. "If this works." "When this works," she said, the same way she'd said he's alive. Not as reassurance, but as a choice. A deliberate one. The kind you made not because you were certain, but because the alternative was to stop moving, and stopping was not something she knew how to do. Elias looked at her then, and what was in his face she didn't try to name. There were things between them that hadn't been said yet, wouldn't be said on a muddy road 4 days from anything resolving, and they both knew it, and that was fine. Some things kept better when they waited. 4 days, he said. 4 days, she agreed. They rode on into the morning, the folder of evidence in Elias's saddlebag, the road opening ahead of them through the cold valley, and Cedar Ridge falling away behind. Marshal Amos Greer's office in Helena occupied the ground floor of a sandstone building on Last Chance Gulch that smelled of wood smoke and old paper and the particular mustiness of files that had been accumulating for years without sufficient shelf space. The marshal himself was a compact man in his mid-50s with a gray mustache and the deliberate, unhurried manner of someone who had learned early in his career that urgency was usually someone else's problem dressed up as an emergency. He received them on the morning of the second day, which was faster than Elias had expected. They had arrived in Helena the previous evening and taken rooms at a boarding house 2 blocks from the marshal's office, and Elias had sent a note immediately upon arrival, and the response had come back within the hour, 9 o'clock the following morning, which meant someone in Greer's office had been waiting for this meeting. That could mean several things, and Elias had spent part of the night considering which of them was most likely. Abigail had slept, or at least had been quiet in her room, which he took as evidence of either genuine exhaustion or the kind of disciplined self-management that she applied to most things. He had not slept particularly well himself. Greer shook both their hands and gestured toward the chairs across from his desk without ceremony. He had a deputy in the room, a young man named Watts, who sat against the wall with a notepad and said nothing the entire meeting. "Mr. Granger," Greer said, "Miss Mercer, your letter described a property fraud situation in Bitterroot County involving a man named Silas Crow. You said you had documentation." "We do," Elias said, and set the folder on the desk. Greer did not reach for it immediately. He looked at both of them first. "Before I look at this, I want to tell you something. Silas Crow's name has come across this desk before. Not in connection with any formal complaint. There has never been a formal complaint. But in connection with inquiries from 2 other counties about land consolidation patterns that looked irregular. We noted it. We didn't have enough to act." He paused. "I'm telling you this so you understand I'm not coming to this conversation cold." Abigail looked at Elias briefly. He kept his expression steady. "Then you know the general shape of how he operates," Elias said. "I know enough to be interested in documentation," Greer said. "Let me see what you have." He read slowly, the same way Elias read, methodically, without expression, going back occasionally to reread a section before continuing. Deputy Watts did not write anything during this period. The room was quiet enough that the fire in the small iron stove at the corner was audible. Greer spent the longest time on Pruitt's statement. He read it twice, set it aside, and then read the section of Walter Hutchins' journal that Vera had marked. Then he set that aside and looked at the loan document comparison, the Mercer agreement open beside the Carver agreement, the relevant clauses side by side. When he finished, he closed the folder and set both hands flat on the desk and looked at them. "The Pruitt statement is the most actionable piece," he said. "It's direct testimony naming Crow in a coercive act connected to a falsified criminal complaint. If Pruitt will repeat this in front of a territorial judge, that's the foundation of a fraud case." He tapped the folder. "The Hutchins Journal is supporting material. A dead man's private record is difficult to introduce as primary evidence, but it corroborates Pruitt and establishes a timeline." He paused. "The loan document discrepancy is interesting. It suggests deliberate manipulation of lending terms prior to a planned acquisition. That's fraud in the preparation, not just the execution." "The water rights transfer through Bitterroot Water and Grazing," Elias said, 4 months before Owen's arrest. "And registered at Crow's address," Greer said, "with a named officer who has now given a statement about how he came to sign those documents." He nodded slowly. "That's a chain, not complete, but a chain." "What would make it complete?" Abigail asked. Greer looked at her directly for the first time since they'd sat down. He had the manner of a man who assessed people the way he assessed documents, systematically, without projecting what he wanted to find. "Banking records," he said. "Crow's correspondence with Fielding's lending house prior to his acquisition of it. If there's written communication between Crow and Fielding's that predates the Mercer loan and references the property or the water rights, that would show the manipulation was planned before the loan was even signed." He paused. "I can compel those records if I open a formal investigation. I cannot compel them on the basis of an informal inquiry." "And to open a formal investigation," Elias said, I need probable cause to believe a fraud has been committed. The question is whether what you've brought me meets that threshold." He was quiet for a moment. "I believe it does. Narrowly, but it does." Abigail felt something shift in her chest. Not relief yet, too early for that, but the specific sensation of a door that has been partially opened beginning to move further. "There's another matter," Elias said. 3 cattle were taken from the Mercer property 2 days before we left. Gates opened, animals removed. No witnesses. No evidence of forced entry." He looked at Greer steadily. "It follows the same pattern used against my brother 6 years ago. A theft complaint against Owen that was manufactured after Crow wanted the land." Greer's expression didn't change. "Has a complaint been filed against Miss Mercer?" "Not that we know of. We left before we could find out." "If one has been filed," Greer said, "I will contact the Bitterroot County Sheriff directly. A theft complaint filed against a property owner while that same property owner has an active fraud complaint pending with this office." He let the implication complete itself. "That would be a significant escalation on Crow's part, and not a wise one." "He doesn't know we're here," Abigail said. Greer looked at her. "He will know? These things travel." He straightened in his chair. "I'm going to open the investigation. I'll issue a formal notice to Crow's legal representative today, which will freeze any active foreclosure proceedings against your property pending the outcome. That buys you time." He paused. "It also tells Crow that someone has finally put something in front of this office with enough substance to act on. He'll respond to that." "How?" Elias asked. "With lawyers first, then probably with whatever leverage he thinks he has on any of your witnesses." Greer looked at both of them. "The people who gave you statements, they need to know this is now a formal matter. They may receive pressure. They need to be prepared for that." "Pruitt is in Butte," Elias said. "He's outside Crow's immediate reach." "Dodd is in Prentice," Abigail said. "He's closer." "And Mrs. Hutchins," Elias added. "Talk to all of them," Greer said. "Tell them the investigation is open. Tell them to contact this office immediately if anyone approaches them about retracting or modifying their statements." He picked up the folder and handed it back to Elias. "I'll need certified copies of the key documents. My deputy can take care of that today before you leave." He looked at them both for a moment. "You've done careful work. Better than most people who come through that door." It wasn't effusive. It wasn't meant to be. It was the assessment of a practical man, and that was exactly how she received it. They rode south out of Helena the following morning. The investigation notice would travel faster than they could. Greer had told them it would go out by territorial telegraph to the Bitterroot County Sheriff's Office and by written notice to Crow's registered legal address within 24 hours. By the time Abigail and Elias were back on the Valley Road, Crow would likely already know. They didn't talk about it much on the first day of the return ride. There was a kind of exhaustion that settled after the meeting. Not the exhaustion of failure, but of effort completed, which had its own particular weight. They made camp at dusk off the main road, a spot sheltered by a stand of lodge pole pine where the ground was dry enough to lay bedrolls without the cold coming straight up through. Elias built the fire and Abigail cooked, which was the arrangement they had arrived at without discussing it. She had brought bread and salt pork from the boarding house, and she made something approximating a meal out of it while he set up the camp with the same methodical efficiency he brought to fence work and barn repairs. After they ate, they sat with the fire between them and the dark on both sides, and for a while neither of them said anything. It was comfortable, the silence, the kind that doesn't require filling. "Owen will need somewhere to stay when he comes back," Abigail said. Elias looked at the fire. "The house is in decent shape now. Roof's sound. The stove works." He paused. "He can stay there while he decides what to do with the property." "Is that what he'll want? The property?" "I don't know," Elias said honestly. 6 years away from a place changes your relationship to it. It might not be home anymore. It might just be the place where the bad thing happened. He picked up a small stick and turned it in his hands. But he should have the choice. He never got to make the choice before. She nodded. She understood the value of a choice made freely, from a position of something other than desperation. "What will you do?" she asked. "After." He looked up from the stick. "After what?" "After Owen comes back. After the investigation. After—" She gestured, which encompassed everything they'd been doing for weeks. All of it. He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped and settled. "Finish rebuilding the ranch," he said. It's going to take 2 more seasons to get it producing properly. The south pasture needs drainage work, and I haven't started on the outbuildings yet." He paused. "What are you going to do?" "Expand the dairy," she said. "If the water rights are confirmed and the debt is cleared, and they will be, I want to run twice the volume. The hotel in Cedar Ridge has been buying from a supplier in the next county because I can't fill their order with what I produce now. I could fill it." "2 seasons," he said. "You could fill it." "1 season if I start early." She looked at him across the fire. "I have plans, Elias. I've had plans for 3 years, and every time I got close to having enough space to act on them, something else came up that needed the money first." She paused. "I'm tired of having plans that don't get to be real yet." He looked at her for a long moment. "They're going to be real," he said. "You don't know that." "No," he said, "but I know you. And plans you've had for 3 years don't stay plans when the person holding them doesn't quit." She looked at him steadily. It was, she thought, one of the more precisely true things anyone had said to her in a long time. She didn't thank him for it because it wasn't the kind of thing that wanted thanks. She just held it. "We should sleep," she said. "Long day tomorrow." "Yes," he agreed. Neither of them moved immediately. The fire burned between them, and the pines were dark on both sides. And somewhere in the direction of Cedar Ridge, the valley waited with everything it contained. The ranch and the spring and the route and the questions still outstanding and whatever Crow had done or was doing in the hours since the investigation notice had gone out. She fell asleep faster than she expected. They came back to Cedar Ridge on the afternoon of the 4th day to find that Crow had not waited. Jim Carver was at her gate when they rode in, which was the first signal that something had happened. Carver did not make social calls without reason. He was standing with his horse, a piece of paper in his hand, and his face had the expression of a man holding something he doesn't want to be holding. "There's a theft complaint," he said, before either of them had fully dismounted. "Filed 2 days ago. Sheriff's office posted a notice at the property." Abigail took the paper from him. It was a formal notice from the Bitterroot County Sheriff's Office. A complaint had been received alleging that cattle belonging to a third party had been found on the Mercer property. The complainant's name, listed at the bottom, was a man named Roy Lester. She did not recognize the name. "Who is Roy Lester?" she asked. "He works Crow's North Range," Carver said. "Has for 3 years. I know him by sight. Stocky man, red beard. He's not independent. He works for Crow." He looked at her carefully. "Abigail, the sheriff came out and looked at the pasture. He found 2 of your missing cattle." She went very still. "They were back," Carver said. "2 of the 3. Branded, not your brand. Someone put a different brand on them while they were gone and then returned them." The specific coldness of that settled through her slowly. It was elegant in its cruelty. Take the cattle, alter the brand, return them, file a complaint. The cattle are on her property. The brand is not hers. The story writes itself. "The third one?" Elias asked. "Still missing," Carver said. "Where's the sheriff now?" Abigail asked. "He wants to talk to you. He left word you should come to his office when you got back." Carver looked uncomfortable. "He's not... I don't think he's hostile exactly, but he's in a difficult position. There's a complaint in front of him with what looks like physical evidence." Elias was already thinking through it. She could see it in his face. "The investigation notice from Greer," he said. "Has it reached the sheriff's office?" "I don't know," Carver said. "If it has, the sheriff knows he's operating in territory where a formal federal investigation is pending. That changes what he can do with a local complaint." He looked at Abigail. "We go to the sheriff first, today, before anything else." "Together," she said. "Together." The Bitterroot County Sheriff was a man named Walt Odom, who had held the office for 11 years and had the specific institutional weariness of someone who had seen enough of human behavior to be unsurprised by most of it, but still found it tiring. He was behind his desk when they came in, and he looked at both of them with an expression that was carefully professional. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Granger." He had not met Elias before, but he clearly knew the name. "Sit down." They sat. "There's a complaint," Odom said. "You've seen the notice." "We have," Abigail said. "Those cattle were taken from my property. Someone altered the brand while they had them and returned them. The intention was to manufacture a theft accusation." Odom looked at her for a moment. "That's a serious allegation." Roy Lester works for Silas Crow, Elias said. Crow has an active fraud complaint pending with Marshal Greer's office in Helena. The investigation was formally opened 2 days ago. The notice should have reached your office by now. Odom's expression shifted very slightly. He turned to a stack of papers on the corner of his desk and sorted through them until he found what he was looking for. He read it, set it down. I received it this morning, he said. Then you know that any action on local complaints against the Mercer property while the federal investigation is pending needs to be coordinated with the marshal's office, Elias said. Not aggressive, just clear. Odom looked at the investigation notice. Then he looked at them. Tell me about the cattle. They told him everything. The original disappearance, the timeline, the diversion dam upstream, the survey stakes at the spring. They told him about the Granger precedent, Owen's case, the 6-year pattern. Elias put the copies of the key documents on the desk. Greer had kept the originals, but they had made copies before leaving Helena. Odom read slowly. He was not a quick reader, but he was thorough. When he finished, he folded his hands on the desk. I've been sheriff here for 11 years, he said. In that time, 3 families in this county have lost property in circumstances I was not comfortable with. I opened inquiries in 2 of those cases. Both times I ran into walls I couldn't get over with what I had. He paused. I was not aware there was a case building in Helena. I was not aware of the Pruitt statement or the Dodd connection. Now you are, Abigail said. Now I am. He looked at the complaint notice from Lester. I'm going to put this on hold pending the federal investigation. That's within my discretion when there's a higher-level inquiry in process. He set it aside. But I want to be straight with you. Putting it on hold doesn't make it disappear. If the federal investigation stalls or is closed without action, this complaint comes back. It won't stall, Elias said. I hope you're right. Odom stood, which meant the meeting was ending. Stay visible. Don't do anything that looks like flight or concealment. And tell whoever spoke to the marshal's office to keep the communication open with me as well. I'd rather coordinate than find out I'm working at cross purposes. They shook his hand and left. Outside, on the wooden sidewalk in front of the sheriff's office, the afternoon had turned cold and sharp, the kind of cold that came in fast when the sun dropped behind the western peaks. Carver was waiting for them across the road. She shook her head slightly at him. Not good news, not bad news, somewhere in the complicated middle. And he nodded and mounted his horse and rode south toward his own property. Odom's not Crow's man, Elias said quietly, still looking at the door they'd come out of. No, she agreed. He's just careful. Careful is fine. Careful means he'll follow the process. He looked at her. Crow will push back against the investigation. He has lawyers who are good at finding ways to slow things down. We need the community gathering. She looked at him. They had talked about this once, briefly, in the context of the original plan. The annual meeting of Valley landowners that happened each spring in Cedar Ridge, where disputes were aired, agreements were made, and the county's unofficial social order was reinforced for another year. It was 3 weeks away. That's where we make it public, she said. If it's only in the marshal's office, it's invisible, Elias said. Crow can fight an invisible process with lawyers and delays, and he has the resources to outlast it. But if everyone in this valley knows what he's done, if they hear it in the same room he's sitting in, then it's not just a legal matter anymore, she said. It's a social one. And a man who has built his power on other people's compliance cannot survive a room full of people who have all just realized they've been manipulated by the same hand. He paused. Most of those people have had dealings with Crow. Some of them have lost things. They didn't have the connections to see the pattern, but if you show them the pattern, they'll recognize it, she said, in their own history. She thought about it. The risks were real. Crow would be there. His lawyers might try to have anything said in a public meeting used against them in some procedural way. And there was the possibility, the very real possibility, that the room would freeze, that people who had been afraid of Crow for a decade would stay afraid even with the evidence in front of them. It has to be the right person presenting it, she said. I know, he said. Not you, she said. Granger is a name with a complicated history in this valley. People sympathize, but they remember the old arguments too. It has to be someone the valley trusts without reservation. He looked at her. You're thinking Carver. Carver and Vera Hutchins, she said. Carver is respected. He's been here 30 years. He runs his place straight. He's already been through his own fight with Crow. People know that. And She paused. Vera is Walter's widow. Walter was the deputy who processed Owen's complaint. If she stands up and reads from that journal in public, it means something different than if either of us present it. They'd have to be willing, Elias said. I'll ask them tomorrow. He nodded. Then he was quiet for a moment, looking at the road. You know this puts them in Crow's path directly, he said. If he retaliates against witnesses after a public presentation, that's also evidence, she said. And Greer's office would not overlook retaliation against witnesses in an active investigation. She paused. We're asking them to take a risk. We have to be honest about that. She asked Carver that evening. He sat with it for a few minutes, the way he sat with most things, elbows on the table, hands together, looking at the middle distance. And then he said, if you'd asked me 2 months ago, I probably would have said no. But I've been watching this thing you two have been building, and I keep thinking, if not now, when? If not this, what? He looked at her. Yes, I'll do it. Vera was harder to reach. She had said when she gave the journal that she was tired of carrying it. But the distance between handing something privately to someone you trusted and standing up in a public room to read from it was considerable. Abigail went to her porch the following morning, and Vera listened to the whole of it without interruption. And when Abigail finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that a sparrow landed on the porch rail and looked at them both and flew away. Walter would have wanted this done a long time ago, Vera said finally. I know, Abigail said. He was afraid, Vera said. Not a cowardly man, but afraid of what it would cost. The job, the income, the standing in town. She paused. He made the wrong choice. I've had 2 years to make peace with that. She looked at Abigail. If I read from that journal in public, I'm also saying that Walter made a wrong choice. People will hear that. Yes, Abigail said honestly. Vera was quiet again. People already know it, she said to herself as much as to Abigail. They just haven't said so. She straightened in her chair. All right, I'll be there. The Valley Gathering was held in the Cedar Ridge Community Hall, a long wooden building that smelled of pine resin and old tobacco and the accumulated presence of many meetings over many years. It was called for the third Saturday of March, which meant 17 days from the moment Abigail and Elias had shaken Odom's hand outside his office. In those 17 days, 3 things happened. The first was that Crow's lawyer, a man named Fielding, no relation to the lending house, who came up from the county seat and wore a coat that cost more than most people's monthly income, arrived at Abigail's property with a formal letter demanding that she cease any public discussion of the fraud allegations pending the investigation on the grounds that public statements could prejudice a fair legal proceeding. Abigail read the letter carefully, showed it to Elias, and wrote a response noting that she would be happy to discuss the matter with Marshal Greer's office and would take their guidance on the appropriate forum for presenting documented evidence. She sent it by post and did not hear back. The second thing that happened was that a man from Helena rode through Cedar Ridge and stopped at 3 different properties with polite inquiries about whether anyone had additional information relevant to certain land matters in the county. He did not identify himself as working for Crow's lawyer, but he didn't need to. Jim Carver told him he had nothing to say to people who hadn't introduced themselves properly and closed his gate. Thomas Halverson said the same, in more words and with less restraint. Vera Hutchins opened her door, looked at the man on her porch, and said, I know what you're doing, and it won't work. Good day, and shut the door before he finished his first sentence. The third thing was that a letter arrived for Elias from Billings. Owen was coming. He would not arrive before the gathering. Billings was too far and the time too short, but he had written that he was settling his affairs and would be in Cedar Ridge within 2 weeks of the meeting. He wrote in the careful, slightly formal way of a man who had been alone a long time and had gotten out of the habit of easy expression. He wrote that he didn't know what to expect. He wrote that he was grateful someone had not forgotten. Elias read the letter twice and then folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and went back to work on the south pasture drainage. And Abigail let him because there are things a person needs to work through with their hands rather than their mouth. On the morning of the gathering, the community hall filled earlier than usual. Word had traveled, the way word traveled in small valleys where everyone knew everyone's property history, and half of them had at some point wondered about the same things. They came in 1s and 2s and small groups, men and women who had been farming and ranching in the Bitterroot Valley for years, some of them for generations. Crow arrived 20 minutes before the formal opening, with his lawyer and a man Abigail didn't recognize who carried a leather satchel, with the careful attention of someone whose job was to carry things carefully. Crow was well dressed, as always. He wore his money the way some men wore weapons, visibly and with intention. He took a seat toward the front and spoke to no one. Abigail sat 3 rows back with Elias on her left and Vera Hutchins on her right. Carver was at the front of the room near the speaker's podium, talking quietly with the county assessor. When the meeting was called to order, the regular business went first: grazing boundaries, road maintenance, the spring irrigation schedule. Abigail sat through it with the patience of someone who has learned that there is no shortcut through the necessary steps. When the floor opened for general matters, Carver stood. He spoke for 6 minutes. He did not use dramatic language. He described what he had found in his own loan documents compared with Abigail's. He described the diversion dam upstream of the Mercer property, what he had seen with his own eyes, and what he had written in his account. He described the pattern of bitterroot water and grazing and the connection to Crow's address. He spoke the way he did everything, plainly, without embellishment, which was more persuasive than eloquence would have been. Crow's lawyer stood twice to object that the forum was inappropriate for legal matters. Both times, the county assessor reminded him that community gatherings were not courts, and that neighbors had the right to share information about matters affecting their properties. Then Vera stood. The room went quieter when she did. Everyone knew Vera. Everyone had known Walter. She read 3 passages from the journal. She read them steadily, without performance, in the voice of a woman who had made a decision and was keeping it. The passage about Denny Pruitt arriving scared rather than aggrieved. The passage about the meeting with the county sheriff and the man Hutchins described only as the merchant. The passage, the last one she read, in which Walter Hutchins wrote, "I know what I did was wrong. I have told myself there was no other way, and I no longer believe that." The hall was silent. Crow said loudly enough to be heard across the room, "This is a dead man's private scribblings. It means nothing legally." Vera looked at him. "It means something," she said, "to every person in this room who knew Walter." Crow stood. He had prepared something. She could tell from the way he held himself, the slight forward angle of a man about to make an argument he has rehearsed. He said that the allegations were unfounded, that the federal inquiry was a politically motivated fishing expedition, that the Mercer woman was a defaulting debtor attempting to escape her legal obligations through slander, and that anyone in this room who allowed themselves to be used in this way would answer for it. The threat landed differently than he expected. It landed in a room full of people who had, in the preceding 12 minutes, watched a man they respected and a widow they had known for 30 years describe, in plain and specific terms, something that many of them had always half suspected but never had in front of them this clearly. Crow was still standing, still talking, when old Halverson, the father, not either of the brothers, a man in his mid-70s who had been in the valley longer than almost anyone else present, stood up slowly and said, "Silas, sit down." It was not loud. It did not need to be. Crow looked at him. The room looked at Crow. And in that moment, in the gap between what Crow had expected and what the room was actually doing, the architecture of years of carefully maintained authority showed its first genuine crack. He sat. Not because he had conceded anything, but because the room had shifted around him in a way he hadn't planned for, and he was smart enough to know, in that moment, that pressing forward was not going to achieve what pressing forward had always achieved before. Abigail sat in her chair and did not let herself feel it yet. There was still the legal process, still the investigation, still the weeks and months of work that would come after this. One room turning on a man was not the same as a court ruling against him, but it was not nothing. She looked at Elias beside her. He was looking at the front of the room, his face composed, the jaw set the way it was set when he was holding something carefully. She said nothing. Neither did he. The meeting went on around them, and Cedar Ridge, which had been Silas Crow's valley in every practical sense for nearly a decade, was, very quietly and with the slow deliberateness of a thing that has finally decided to move, beginning to be something else. The crack that had opened in the community hall did not close. Crow left the gathering that Saturday without speaking to anyone, his lawyer close at his side, the man with the leather satchel a half step behind. People watched him go the way you watch something you've been afraid of for a long time and are only now beginning to realize you don't have to be, with a complicated mixture of relief and residual wariness, Because fear that has lived in you for years doesn't leave in an afternoon just because the facts have changed. But something had shifted. Abigail felt it in the days that followed in ways she hadn't expected. 3 neighbors she had only known by name stopped her on the valley road to say they'd been at the gathering. A woman named Clara Pete, whose husband had lost a grazing lease to crow 4 years back in circumstances that had never sat right with anyone, came to buy milk for the first time and paid double without explaining why. The Halverson brothers, both of them, which was unusual, rode by the Mercer property on a Tuesday for no stated reason and spent 40 minutes helping Elias reset the gateposts that Crow's men had loosened when they'd moved the cattle. No one made speeches about it. People in the valley didn't do that. They just showed up and did the thing, and that was how you knew where you stood. Marshal Greer's investigation moved faster than Abigail had expected and slower than she'd hoped, which was, she came to understand, simply the nature of legal processes conducted properly. The banking records subpoena went out within a week of the gathering. It took another 3 weeks to produce results, because Crow's lawyers contested the scope of the subpoena on procedural grounds, and Greer's office had to go back to the territorial court to have the scope confirmed. Abigail learned about this through letters from Greer's deputy, which arrived on an irregular schedule and were written in the careful, bloodless language of official correspondence. She read each one at the kitchen table, translated it into plain terms for her mother, and filed it in the tin box alongside everything else. Elias came for breakfast every morning. Neither of them had formally decided this was the arrangement. It had simply continued from where it started, the way certain things continue when no one objects, and everyone quietly prefers them. He arrived before her route started, had coffee ready when she came in from the morning check, and they went over whatever had arrived or whatever needed planning while they ate. Then she drove her route, and he worked his property, and they met again in the evening when there was something to discuss. It was, she thought once, the most practical arrangement for 2 people running properties in the same valley. She did not think too hard about whether it was only that. Owen arrived on a Thursday in the second week of April, 17 days after the gathering. Elias had told her he was coming, but not the exact day, because the exact day was uncertain. Owen had written from Billings that he would leave when he could and arrive when the road allowed, and that was all the precision he could offer. She was on her route when it happened. She came back to find Elias's horse at her fence line and 2 horses in the Granger yard across the road, and she knew before she reached the gate. She almost turned away. It was a family moment, private, and she had learned over the past months that there were things between the Granger brothers that belonged to them. But Elias was already at the fence, watching her come up the road, and his expression told her he had been watching for her. "He's here," Elias said. "I know." She stopped the wagon. "Is he all right?" Elias paused. "He's thinner than I remembered. He looks like someone who's been living careful for too long." He looked back toward the house. "He cried when I told him about Pruitt's statement, that the accusation had been manufactured, that we had a witness who confirmed it. He said he'd spent 6 years believing there might be some version of events where he'd actually done something wrong and hadn't known it." He stopped. He'd been carrying that. She sat with that for a moment. The specific cruelty of it, not just losing your land, but losing your certainty about your own innocence. "Can I meet him?" she asked. "That's why I'm standing at the fence," Elias said. Owen Granger was sitting at his brother's kitchen table when she came in, and he stood when she entered with the automatic courtesy of a man raised to stand when someone entered a room. He was, as Elias had said, thinner, lean in the way of someone who had been working hard on insufficient food, his face weathered and a little older than his years. He had Elias's dark coloring, but not Elias's stillness. His hands moved when he talked. His eyes were the kind that showed everything. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Owen," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She sat across from him. Elias leaned in the doorway. "I want you to know," Owen said, and then stopped and started again. "I want to say thank you. Elias told me what you did, the loan documents, the people you talked to, the trip to Helena, that you rode 4 days for this." He shook his head slightly. I didn't think anyone was still—" "Your brother came home," she said simply. The rest followed from that. Owen looked at Elias, something passing between them that was too private to name. "How does it look?" Owen asked. "The investigation. What do you actually expect?" She had been asked this question only by people who wanted reassurance. He was asking it the way she would have asked it, wanting the honest answer, not the comfortable one. Greer has the banking records now, she said. The correspondence between Crow and Fielding's predating my father's loan confirms the clause was inserted at Crow's direction. That's documented fraud in the preparation of a lending agreement. She paused. Combined with Pruitt's statement, the Dodd connection, and the Hutchins journal, Greer believes he has enough for a criminal fraud charge. Not just a civil property dispute, criminal. She looked at Owen directly. And the original theft complaint against you is being re-examined as part of the fraud pattern. Greer's office has contacted the territorial court about a formal vacatur, clearing it from the record entirely. Owen was quiet for a long time. How long? He asked. The trial won't be fast, she said honestly. Crow has lawyers and resources, and he'll use both to slow things down. Greer says 6 months to a year before a verdict. She paused. But the foreclosure on my property has been stayed pending the investigation. The water rights are frozen. He can't move on anything while it's active. So you're safe, Owen said. For now, she said, and I think for good. But I don't say that because I'm certain. I say it because the evidence is solid and the marshal believes in it. He nodded slowly. That's honest, he said. I appreciate honest. So does your brother, she said. From the doorway, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. The banking records. When Greer's deputy summarized them in a letter that arrived on a Monday morning in late April, were more complete than Abigail had dared to expect. There were 4 letters, recovered from Fielding's retained correspondence files, written over the course of 8 months prior to the Mercer loan signing. 3 were from Crow's own hand. She recognized the formal, controlled phrasing from his demand letter, the same character in the language, deliberate and precise. They discussed the Mercer property in terms that were careful enough to seem innocent and specific enough to be damning. The spring's yield measurements, the road access value, the anticipated difficulty of the family, given their reduced circumstances following the senior Mercer's death. They discussed the loan terms. They discussed, in one letter, the collateral clause, referred to as the enhanced security provision, and its insertion into the Mercer agreement specifically, with the notation that the provision need not appear irregular if formatted consistently with standard document structure. Formatted to look standard. Those were almost exactly the words she had used herself, sitting at the kitchen table with Elias 3 months ago. The 4th letter was from Fielding himself, responding to Crow's instructions, and it confirmed receipt and agreement with language that would have made any territorial judge's expression go cold. She sat with the summary letter for a long time. Then she wrote back to Greer's deputy and asked what the timeline looked like. The response came the following week. Crow had been formally charged. The charges included fraud in the preparation of lending documents, conspiracy to deprive landowners of property rights through manufactured criminal accusations, and illegal interference with natural watercourses. He had been released pending trial on a substantial bond that had, apparently, required some arrangement of his holdings to produce, which meant his financial position was no longer what it had been. Crow's lawyer had already begun filing motions to delay the trial. Greer's deputy wrote that this was expected and that the territorial court had assigned a judge who had handled similar matters before and was not known for patience with procedural obstruction. The trial date was set for the following February. The months between the charges and the trial were not quiet, but they were different from what had come before. The active danger, the pressure, the manufactured accusations, the sense of something closing in, had receded. What replaced it was the slower, steadier work of rebuilding, which was in some ways harder because it lacked the clarifying force of a clear enemy. Abigail expanded the dairy as she had planned. She hired a girl named Hattie, 16 years old and strong and not afraid of early mornings, to help with the bottling and the afternoon cleaning. She renegotiated with the Cedar Ridge Hotel directly. She had been right that they wanted a local supplier for their full volume, and signed a 12-month agreement that gave her something she had not had in 3 years of route work, a guaranteed baseline. She still drove the route. She would always drive the route, she thought, or something like it, not because the route was necessary for survival anymore, but because the people on it were hers in some real, if wordless way. Old Mrs. Halverson with her left side preference. The Kowalski brothers and their weekly argument about a price they always paid. Miss Danner, who had covered the route for 4 days while Abigail and Elias were in Helena, and who had done it without complaint, and with the exact level of care Abigail would have wanted, and to whom Abigail had, after considerable internal resistance, allowed herself to feel genuinely grateful. Elias worked his property through the summer and into the fall with the focused economy of a man who has a clear picture of what he's building toward, and is building toward it one day at a time. The South Pasture drainage project he'd mentioned took most of July. The outbuildings were framed and sided by September. He brought in 6 cattle in October, which was a small start, but a start. Owen stayed. That had not been certain in the early weeks. He had come back with the manner of a man who hadn't entirely decided yet, who was testing whether this place felt like his again, or whether the years had made it strange. He worked alongside Elias at first without committing to anything, helping where help was needed. And then one afternoon in May, he spent 4 hours repairing a section of fence on the east boundary that Elias hadn't asked him to touch. And when Elias came by and saw it done, neither of them said anything about it. Owen was staying. That was the announcement, made in the way the Granger brothers apparently made most announcements, through an action rather than a declaration. The vacatur of his theft conviction came through in June, 4 months after Greer's investigation opened the original records. It arrived as a formal document from the territorial court, dry and official, the language of the law applied to the task of undoing what the law had once done wrong. Owen read it at the kitchen table of the Granger house, and then went outside and walked the south fence line alone for about an hour, and came back and made coffee, and didn't say anything about it directly for 2 days. Then he said to Elias, on a Wednesday morning while they were working on the barn roof, I keep thinking about all the things I should have done differently, earlier, stood my ground instead of leaving. Elias drove a nail before answering. Would it have made a difference, he asked, if you'd stayed? Owen thought about it. Maybe not. He had the whole system working for him, the lawyer, the sheriff, the lending house. I didn't have any of what you ended up finding. You didn't have someone to look with, Elias said. He drove another nail. That's not a failure of character. That's a circumstance. Owen was quiet for a while. Is that supposed to make me feel better? Not particularly, Elias said. I just think you've been deciding it was your fault for a long time, and I don't think that's accurate. It was, Abigail thought later when Elias told her about the conversation, exactly the right thing to say and exactly the right way to say it. Not comforting in a way that minimized anything, just accurate. Owen had been doing what people do when they've been badly hurt by something, building a story that made it their own fault, because fault you own feels more controllable than wrong. That was done to you without your consent and without your being able to stop it. She understood that particular habit from the inside. The trial began on a Tuesday in February, 14 months after Abigail had first stood at the Granger gate, with 2 bottles of milk and a schedule to keep. She and Elias rode to the county seat together, which by then required no particular explanation to anyone who knew them, and which Ruth Mercer had acknowledged by saying, as they left, "Don't stay for the verdict if it goes long. The dairy won't run itself," which was her mother's way of saying be careful and come home, compressed into practical language. The courtroom was not large. It filled with people who had made the ride from Cedar Ridge and the surrounding valley, Carver and his wife, the Halverson brothers, Vera Hutchins in Walter's wool shawl, a dozen others whose faces Abigail knew and some she didn't. Owen was there, sitting 2 rows behind her, and when she glanced back at him, he looked like a man who had been waiting for this for 6 years and had run out of the ability to feel either hope or dread and had arrived at something that was simply endurance. The proceedings lasted 4 days. Crow's lawyers were skilled. They found every procedural angle available to them and pressed each one fully, which was their job, and which they did without evident conscience. They were not defending a man they believed was innocent, she suspected, so much as performing the function of legal defense in the way it was meant to be performed, which was to make the prosecution prove everything it claimed. The motions were denied mostly, but each one cost time and energy and generated the specific anxiety of watching a process move so slowly that you started to doubt it was moving at all. Pruitt testified on the second day. He came from Butte, and he sat in the witness chair and he told the truth in the careful, slightly formal way of a man who has rehearsed not because he planned to lie, but because he was afraid his voice would fail him if he didn't have the words ready. He named Crow. He described the meeting, the threat, the instruction, and the payment. He did not look at Crow while he testified, which was probably wise. Crow's lawyer cross-examined Pruitt for 2 hours. He suggested that Pruitt's memory was unreliable, that 6 years was a long time, that a man with Pruitt's motivations, having cooperated with a complaint that ruined another man's life, might construct a story that reframed his own role. Pruitt sat through it and answered each question with the same careful precision. At one point, the lawyer suggested that Pruitt had approached Greer's office voluntarily because he was seeking some form of immunity from prosecution. Pruitt said quietly that Elias Granger had come to him, not the other way around, and that he had decided to tell the truth because it was time. The lawyer pressed further on this point. Pruitt said, "I've been ashamed of this for 6 years. That's long enough." The courtroom was very quiet after that. Dodd testified on the third day, shorter and more technical, explaining the mechanics of how bitterroot water and grazing had been registered, on whose instruction, and what he had been told about its purpose. How it was precise and unemotional. And when Crow's lawyer asked whether he had understood at the time that his participation was potentially improper, Dodd said, "I understood it was unusual. I chose to accept the fee and not examine it too closely. I should have examined it." The banking correspondence was introduced on the third afternoon. The territorial court had appointed an independent document examiner who confirmed the authenticity of all 4 letters and who testified as to their meaning in the context of the loan agreement, using language that even Crow's lawyer could not effectively complicate. The enhanced security provision, formatted to look standard. The words went into the record of the court as they had gone into Abigail's understanding months earlier, quietly and with the specific weight of things that cannot be unsaid once they have been said. Crow testified on the 4th morning. He was dressed well, as always. He was composed, as always. He denied having directed the filing of the complaint against Owen. He described the bitterroot water and grazing registration as a legitimate business arrangement. He characterized the loan clause as standard industry practice and the investigation as a coordinated attack by people who owed money they couldn't pay. He was a good witness for himself. She had to acknowledge it. He had the confidence of someone who had been telling a particular version of events for so long that he had learned to tell it without the hesitation or the slight misalignment of eye contact that marks a lie from the outside. She watched the jury while he testified, and she could not read them, which frightened her more than she wanted to admit. Elias, beside her, did not move. His hands were quiet on his knees. She had learned to read his stillness by now. It was not the stillness of someone who was at peace. It was the stillness of someone who was holding something very tightly so it would not escape. She put her hand over his. He turned his palm up under hers, and that was all. The jury went out on the afternoon of the 4th day and came back the following morning. She did not sleep much the night in between. She lay in the room at the boarding house and listened to the town outside and thought about her father, who had dug the spring with his own hands the summer before she was born, hauling stone and working the digging bar through 2 feet of rock to reach the water that ran clean and cold all year. He had not done it for future value. He had done it because his family needed water. It was only later, when someone else decided the spring was worth taking, that it became a thing that had to be protected. That was the thing about what people built, she thought. It was never built to be contested. It was built because it was needed. The contest came afterward, when someone else decided what you'd built was worth more to them than to you. She fell asleep eventually, near dawn, and dreamed of nothing she could remember. The jury came back at 10 in the morning. Guilty on the fraud charge. Guilty on the conspiracy charge. Guilty on the illegal interference count. Crow sat at the defense table and did not react visibly, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had seen him do in the entire proceeding. A man confronting a verdict that confirmed what he had always known about himself, with no audience left worth performing for. His lawyer was already writing something. The appeals process would begin immediately, she knew. This was not the absolute end of the legal matter. But the conviction stood, and with it, the stayed foreclosure on her property was permanently nullified, and the fraudulent water rights transfer through bitterroot water and grazing was voided by order of the territorial court, and the Mercer family spring, which her father had dug with his own hands, and which Abigail had protected with 11 months of 4 in the morning wake-ups, and then 14 more months of accumulated documents and witnesses, and 4 days' ride to Helena and back, was confirmed, in language that would be filed in county records, as belonging to the Mercer property without encumbrance. Owen, 2 rows back, let out a breath that she heard from where she sat. She didn't look back. Some moments belonged to the person having them. She and Elias walked out of the courthouse into February air that was cold and sharp and smelled of pine and road mud, and they stood on the steps for a moment without saying anything, the way you stand when something that has consumed you for a long time has finally resolved, and you haven't yet figured out what your hands should do when they're not holding it anymore. "It's done," she said. "Most of it," he said. "The appeals will take time, but the property is secure." "Yes." She looked out at the street. Horses and wagons and people going about the business of an ordinary Thursday in a county seat, entirely unaware that anything significant had just happened in the building behind her. That was something she had noticed about important moments in her own life. They were invisible to everyone else. The morning her father died, the rest of the valley had proceeded normally. The day she'd read Crow's demand letter, the sun had still gone down at the usual time. The world did not organize itself around your crises. It continued and you continued in it, and eventually the crisis became something you had survived rather than something you were surviving. "What do you want to do?" Elias asked. She thought about it. "Go home," she said. "Get back on the route tomorrow. Hattie's managed 3 days, but she shouldn't have to manage 4. He smiled at that, genuinely, the full version she'd learned to distinguish from the partial versions he used in other contexts. "All right," he said. They rode back to Cedar Ridge that afternoon, and she thought about what it meant to go home, not as a concept, but as a specific physical fact. The house her father had built. The barn she'd worked through every season of her adult life. The spring, running quiet and constant, regardless of who was trying to claim it, because water didn't know about property disputes and kept moving in the direction gravity required. The route. 14 stops in the dark. The daily reality of a life built on a thing as plain as milk. Something people needed, something she could provide, something that would never be dramatic or impressive to anyone looking at it from the outside, but that had kept her mother alive and her property solvent and her mind occupied during the worst of the past 2 years. She had learned something from the past 14 months that she was still in the process of understanding fully. She had learned it not in the courthouse or in Greer's office or at the community gathering, but in smaller moments. At the Granger kitchen table in the early mornings, on the creek bank looking at a diversion dam, in Jim Carver's yard reading loan documents, in Vera Hutchins' kitchen watching an old woman decide she was tired of carrying something and hand it over. The thing she had learned was this: the people who take from others count on 2 conditions holding. They count on the victims being isolated from each other, and they count on the victims being more afraid than they are determined. Break either condition, and the scheme starts to fail. Break both, and it collapses. She had not been a particularly trusting person before all of this. She was still not, exactly. But she understood trust differently now, not as a feeling but as a decision, made incrementally, based on evidence accumulated over time. You did not trust a person because it felt right. You trusted them because they had shown you, in the small repeated actions of ordinary days, that they were worthy of it. Elias had shown her that over breakfast tables and fence lines and 4 days' ride in winter and a hand-turned palm up in a courtroom. That was not a romantic story, or not only one. It was a practical one. The romance, such as it was, grew out of the practical the way the spring grew out of the rock, not despite the difficulty of the terrain, but through it, following the only path available. He asked her to marry him in May, which was not a surprise to her, but still landed differently than she'd expected. Not as a revelation, but as a confirmation of something she had already decided, meeting the decision she'd made with the decision he'd made. The 2 of them arriving at the same place from their respective directions the way they'd arrived at most things. He did not do it dramatically. There was no special occasion. They were at her fence line after the evening check, and he said, without preamble, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to give me an honest answer, not the answer you think I'm hoping for." "When have I ever given you an answer I thought you were hoping for?" she said. "Fair point," he said. "Abigail, will you marry me?" She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her with the expression she knew best on him, direct, a little uncertain, holding himself carefully. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. "All right," he said. "Were you worried I'd say no?" "I didn't know what you'd say," he said honestly. "I knew what I wanted you to say." "Now you know what I said," she told him. They married in June, outside, in the kind of early summer weather the valley occasionally produced. Warm, but not hot. The air clear, the mountains visible in every direction. It was a small gathering. Ruth Mercer, who cried with the contained dignity of a woman who has been holding something for a long time, and has finally found a moment when it is appropriate to release it. Owen, who shook Elias's hand and then embraced him instead, which was, by all accounts, not something the Granger brothers typically did in public. Jim Carver and his wife. The Halverson brothers, who had argued about the appropriate direction to stand until Thomas told Clem to just pick a side and stand there. Vera Hutchins in Walter's shawl, which she had decided, she told Abigail quietly before the ceremony, she was going to stop wearing so often. Walter would tell me I was being morbid, she said. He would be right. Abigail did not argue. Miss Danner came, and the Kowalski brothers came, and old Mrs. Halverson came, carried in a wagon by her grandson because her knees would no longer manage the walk, but her opinion of missing important events had not moderated with age. They combined the two ranches not immediately, but over the following year, as it made practical sense to do. Shared fencing, shared equipment, shared labor during the peak seasons. Owen held his portion of the Granger property independently, which was exactly right. It was his land cleared and confirmed, and he was building something on it that was his own, rather than a continuation of what had been taken. The dairy doubled in volume by the following spring, as Abigail had calculated it would. The hotel contract held. She hired Hattie full-time, and then, the year after that, hired a second woman named Petra, who had recently arrived in the valley with no connections and needed work, and who turned out to have, once given the space to use it, an instinct for the operational side of dairy management that was better than Abigail's own. She drove the route herself 3 days a week. On the other days, Hattie drove it, and Abigail stayed on the ranch and worked on the expansion plans she'd had for 3 years and was finally building. The plans were not perfect. They were revised constantly, one practical reality after another, pushing against the original conception and requiring adjustment. She had learned to expect this. A plan that survives contact with reality unchanged was not a plan that had truly been tested. Elias rebuilt the South Barn in the fall of the year they were married. Owen built a proper smokehouse on his side of the property, which became, by the following winter, a source of products that people from Cedar Ridge came out specifically to purchase. Small things. Modest things. The kind of things that look, from the outside, like ordinary life. From the inside, they looked different. From the inside, they looked like what they were. A life put back together after a serious attempt to dismantle it, not perfectly, not without the visible marks of what had been broken and repaired, but solid in the way that things are solid when they've been built by people who know exactly what they're building and why. Crow's appeals took 2 years and failed. He served 4 years of a 6-year sentence, which was not enough and was what the law produced, and those were 2 separate facts that had to be held separately rather than reconciled. Abigail accepted that. She had never expected the law to be satisfying. She had only needed it to be sufficient. Denny Pruitt stayed in Butte. He wrote once to Elias, a short letter that said he hoped the case had gone well and that he was glad he'd told the truth when he did. Elias wrote back. They did not become correspondents, but the letter was sent, and that was something. Vera Hutchins sold her house 2 years after the trial and moved to Helena to be near her daughter. Before she left, she gave Abigail the journal. Not on loan, permanently. It belongs with the rest of the evidence, she said. I don't want it in a box in my daughter's house. Abigail put it in the tin box, which by then contained more documents than it had been designed to hold and had developed a slight warp in the lid that she had never gotten around to fixing. She left it that way. Some things you didn't fix because they didn't need to be fixed. They needed to be left as evidence of what they'd been through. The spring ran through every season without stopping. Dry summers, hard winters, the kind of drought years that turned the southern pastures brown and made everyone in the valley quietly anxious. The spring ran through all of it, cold and clear and constant, because that was its nature, and no piece of paper had ever actually changed it. The paper could change who claimed ownership. It could not change the water. Her father had known that. He had built his whole understanding of the place on it, on the reality that the land had its own truth that existed before anyone arrived to name it, and would persist after they were gone. What you did, if you were lucky and stubborn and found the right people to work alongside, was build something in that truth that was worth passing on. She thought about that sometimes. In the early mornings before the route started, standing in the yard with the dark still on the mountains and the spring audible from the fence line. The life she had almost lost. The life she had built instead. The distance between those two things was not, when she examined it honestly, the result of any single dramatic act. It was the result of 11 months of 4 in the morning wake-ups, followed by 14 more months of accumulated small decisions. Talking to one more neighbor, reading one more document, making one more trip down a road she'd never been on, trusting one more person incrementally rather than all at once. That was what courage had looked like in her particular life. Not a dramatic gesture, just persistence, past the point where most people stopped. She had stopped exactly once, for about 40 seconds, standing in the barn after the stakes appeared at the spring, breathing the smell of hay and animals. And then she had loaded the wagon and started the route. She would not say she had known it would work out. She hadn't known. She had known only that stopping would not work out, and that the route needed driving, and that Elias Granger was at the end of it with coffee already made, which was, she supposed, enough to keep moving on.